Rohan, I think the Indian economy is doing reasonably well at the moment. Is that a big part of the BJP's argument for why it should be re-elected?
Yeah, I thought at least for specific to India this week, it would be a bit difficult to talk about the economy at large, given that elections have already begun, and it's not exactly. There's a lot to talk about there, and broadly speaking, I guess the sense of the Indian economy is both that it's doing well compared to its peers and other major economies, but also that its recovery from COVID has been deeply unequal. A K-shaped recovery, as they call it, where the rich are doing well, but the poor are struggling. But I think more immediately, the conversation, if we had to find a smaller section to discuss there, is a question of economic confidence. How people are feeling about the economy rather than how the economy itself is doing, which are two slightly different things. And we've seen in each of our economies also, or each of our polities, that those things can sometimes have quite a large gap between them. There are a couple of ways to measure this in India, one of which is consumer sentiment per se. You have a few statistical agencies in India as well as the central bank measuring this. And for Modi's second term, starting, in fact, going back to 2016, consumer sentiment in India has never been above 100, which is that it's never been higher when surveyed versus a year earlier. It's recovered a lot post-COVID, but it's still not at that 100 market. So people are still reasonably pessimistic on a broad consumer scale. But then there's that other way of measuring sentiments, which is the stock market. And again, following the stock market is quite tricky, again, in each of our three countries, but even more so in India, where it does not reflect a plurality, or certainly not a majority of the Indian population, not even a plurality. It's a small section of people who are invested in stocks, and yet it's taken as it's an indicator of something, certainly of big business, of markets, of investment interest. And so what's interesting that's been happening of late is that the Indian stock market has been quite volatile. The numbers have been all over the place in the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so since elections began. And so you've had this really unusual scenario where both the external affairs minister, which is what India calls its foreign minister, going out and saying, the markets will calm down, don't worry, as every election phase goes forward, it'll get a bit more stable. And then even more to his point, the Home Minister, Amit Shah, often seen as the number two in the government, went out and said people should buy because the rally that you'll see on June 4th when we win is going to be huge. But people should go and buy now. Very interesting to have this happening mid-election. I'm happy to dig into it a bit more, but yeah.
And how much does that play out in? I mean, some of that is playing out in the sort of the national media, but with the sort of, as you say, the K-shaped recovery, does that mean that there's a broad mass of voters who are not feeling that at all and who might even be alienated by politicians coming out and saying how great things are?
So this is the big fear for the BJP. It has been since 2004 when they had an election over 2003. The first time the BJP ran government in India was 1998 and 1999, and a 5-year period from 1999 to 2004 was their first 5-year term. And they seemed to have an extremely popular government at the time. And they ran a campaign called India Shining, which they believed would pull them through into the next election and come back to power. Opinion polls all said that they were firmly in the driver's seat and so on. And then they had a massive loss in 2004. And it has often in the past been blamed on India Shining being an overconfidence thing. And so it's one of those like things that you'll speak to BJP politicians and they'll still be worried about believing and pushing something and having another thing happening out on the ground. I think it does animate their thinking, whereas of course we've moved a lot since then, and Modi's been in power 10 years now, so it's quite different. We don't know if it necessarily alienates people because, one, we don't have good polling survey. So until the results are out, we'll have to see. But also, Modi does not make an untrammelled, like, where everything is great pitch. He does make, we have much more to do. And this is partly why he's been raising the bogey of the other side coming to power and taking away your gains in his election rhetoric. But the other interesting element here is that, as we discussed before, we don't have many indicators between the first day of voting and the final day. And so a lot of people look at the stock market as being an indicator, thinking, oh, the traders must have some insight into what's actually happening on the ground. So people are almost starting to read the markets as being a sign that, oh, maybe big business knows that Modi's not coming back.